Do you think you're going to keep that up?
Thank you very much. So this evening, I will be presenting the budget material. David will support me through that process, and so between the two of us, we'll answer any questions you might have. The nice thing about transitioning into the superintendency over the summer is you do have time to dig into other factors that operate schools, i.e. budgets, and so I can tell you what, today's the 9th of August, and I've spent, what, 37 days on the job and 37 days looking at the budget. So hopefully I can bring some thoughts around our budget this evening to help us move forward with budget planning. So much of this document you've seen in the past, and there are some revisions and edits that I will reference as we go through that this evening. Next slide, please. So summary of the changes. The last time we met, when David presented in July, we do have an update with regards to levy revenue that I'll reference tonight. We do have some decreased cost in supplies and travel that we will represent tonight. And we do have some increases in expenditures that we anticipate based on doing a deeper dive into the budget and finding some items that needed to be addressed. So I'll reference that tonight as well. So as you've seen this before, this really drives school funding. Enrollment, you have to get right. If you don't get your enrollment right, it's like a big machine up at the state of Washington. You enter in the enrollment numbers, and then there's really no manipulation beyond that of the main factors that fund schools. And so David has shared this with you in the past, but I think it's important enough that we talk about it again. We have 5 years represented as actual enrollment numbers. The 2014 to 2018 are actual numbers. FTE, it's not head count, it's full-time equivalency students, all right? And they have to attend full-time in our schools. The 2019 number is the number that represents our estimation. And for districts to be successful in budget planning and budget preparation, you have to hit that number right. And so you can see that we have a slow trend upwards towards our targeted number of 3,639 students. Questions? All right, next. So I have some good news. Last month, when we did this presentation, we noted that we anticipated about a $3.2 million ending fund balance. Now, after July's expenses, we anticipate, August being our last month of expenses that have been encumbered, we anticipate an ending fund balance of $3.58 million. So that's a great piece of news. Questions? All right, next slide. So our general fund summary. We built this budget based on known expenditures, which include salary expenses, which include supply expenses, operational cost expenses, and this summarizes, if we work off of the variables that we built this budget upon, what our ending fund balance might look like. And so our budgeted budgeted revenues this year fall in at just below $54 million. Our budgeted expenditures at current time represent $52.7 million. The difference between our expenditures and our revenue is $1.2 million. That represents a change from the last time we met. If you remember, that was about $900,000. So we have spent the last 30 days or 20 days reviewing our budget, looking at expenses, looking at revenues, and we have a piece of good news around revenue coming to the district exceeds our expenses projected at this point in time by $1.2 million. That's great news. Next, if you take our estimated ending fund balance, which was also adjusted, remember on the last slide, and you multiply those two together, if all of our variables remain the same, you would end up with $4.782 million. Questions?
Most of the revenues represents the levy increase, which we'll get to.
I know you meant add them together.
Yeah, what did I say?
Multiply, because that would be amazing. That would
Thank
be
you.
an amazing.
Addition, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. All right, this is a visual representation of what I just explained to you. Next slide. So now we get into more detail around our revenues. Where is our funding sources coming from? Or where are our funding sources coming from? If you take a look at the first line, which is local taxes, this one is impacted significantly over the next few years. We all know that. The 17-18 budget was just at $8.9 million in local funds we collected based on an election that we ran a few years back. Our proposed budget, again, we've adjusted that number to $6.4 million, rounding numbers, that represent local funds that will be collected. Now, we've all heard in the community that our local levies will be approximately reduced by 50% for Port Angeles. That doesn't apply in year one of the McCleary transition. Year one, we collect full taxes from this point forward. So from now through December 31st, we collect at the full rate. Then the next calendar year, we will collect at approximately the $1.50 rate. So therefore, in year one of the McCleary transition, you see we are going to collect approximately $6.46 million. That's the first year. That represents a reduction of that fund, local revenues, by $2.472 million. I'm going to skip this support non-tax. Let's go to the state general purpose. Our biggest increase in revenue for our district this year is the state general purpose. And I'm going to summarize that. That's our BEA dollars. That's that. Here's our enrollment number, punch it in, and it produces all of the staffing that we know exist in our schools that work off of the BEA apportionment. And that will include people or individuals like principals, teachers, some para-educators, custodians, secretaries. All of those folks are in that formula. Okay? So that represents a significant investment in BEA funding this year, and that's exactly what the McCleary decision required the lawmakers to do. For our district, we see an increase from last year to this year of right around $5.2 million. Good news. State special purpose is also increased, and our increases there basically fall in two significant sales: special education and LAP funding. There are other drivers to that, but those are the primary two increased revenue sources in those funds. You see that those two funds represent $1.6 million in change. Federal dollars remain approximately the same. Okay? The next statement that I'll make is very, very important. The total new revenues to the district, if you take the difference between last year and this year, we project it to be $4.388 million. That number represents increased revenue to the district. We do have more money. Now, we're going to get into more details around what we can do with that money, but there is more money coming in. And that number represents a 9% increase in revenue to our district. We have 9% more revenue coming to our district through all of the transitions that represent that 9%. Next slide, please. Yes.
Hold on just a second here. Question, Superintendent Brewer. So in the state general purpose increase funding, is that purpose of that's BEA funding? Is the purpose of funding also specified by the legislature for maintenance of buildings?
There is in the BEA apportionment what's known as MSOPs.
Okay.
And your maintenance of buildings would fall within that cell.
Right.
That is correct.
There's some
And-
salaries and stuff for
Yeah.
maintenance too.
Right, but and correct me if I've got this understanding incorrect, is that the local levy money after January 1st is enrichment money,
That is correct.
not maintenance.
That is correct.
Okay, thank you.
One other question. Could you remind us, please, what will be the local tax revenues the following year, the year 2019, 2020?
We project, I'm going to get more into that later, but I'll answer it now. We project this number for local revenue to be approximately $4.3 to $4.5 million, depending upon assessed valuation. I mean, that's a key factor in all of this. So, you know, give or take, we used to collect $9 million. We're reducing our levy by about 50%, so 4.5 is a pretty safe number to kind of base that off of.
Okay.
And I'm going to get more into multi-year planning a little later in the presentation.
Could I give Director Meffner some credit on the local taxes? So we did dig into it a little bit more after your question after the last time and used the collection rates to see that actually the September through December collection rates would be a little bit higher at the higher amount. So kudos to you for bringing up that question.
But, yeah.
That's a good question.
But can we use that, I mean, we can use that at that point, this has been my, can we use that levy collection for facilities? Since we're not going to be able to use anything for facilities after
My
January 1.
recommendation to the board this year is we should not. We should not invest additional dollars in our facilities at this point. And if you allow me to please get through the entire,
Okay.
and it's completely just a recommendation, but given, you know, the intent of the dollars from the state and the, you know, the other political factors, this year may not be the right year to put more money into the facilities around maintenance. Okay? The next slide, please. This is just kind of a general overview around our expenditures. And this is a program summary. You can see that you know, the numbers have been adjusted a little bit around expenditures. The big numbers that I want to call you out to is this. How we build a budget is we take, for Chuck's lab budget, if it represents $1.9 million and $300,000 of that is new money, we budget that as revenue in $1.9 million, and we budget it as expenditures out as $1.9 million. If we don't do that, even though that $300,000 that's kind of sitting out there that's new, if we don't do that, we can't spend it. So when you look at this document and you see this last year we had $50.3 million in, you know, to date, $50.3 million in expenses. And then you say, well, my gosh, for 18-19, we've already projected an expenditure of $52.7 million. You know, that's a legitimate question to say, well, where's all that money going? Well, it's new revenue that we're asking the board to approve to spend. Some of that may be accounted for. Most of it may not be. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the difference in expenditures from one year to the next that we have recorded by way of known variables today, that being one, salary increases, step and column, represent $2.4 million in additional expenses at this point in time. All right, next slide, please. Then this gets into by function. You can see that approximately you know, $20.8 million go into certificated salaries, and we have built in our step and column based on current negotiated agreements to provide salary enhancements based on current agreements. That represents $322,000. You get to the classified salaries, approximately $9.78 million. We show an increase here, and Bill brought this up, and I was asking the very same question, and I want to answer that tonight. With the late arrival of funds in high poverty lap last year, And they came late,
August
August.
15th.
We didn't have a chance to budget for those high poverty dollars that came in as significant funds. And so we had to add we added positions, some positions with those high poverty dollars, usually in the form of classified salaries. And so we were able to provide more supports for our students using those dollars of our system that had high poverty students within. This represents 12 positions of that very nature. And so therefore you can see, that the first question I had and Bill had was, why are our classified salary enhancements and outpacing the certificated? Well, it's not only the step and column for the classified employees, but it's also additional positions that we didn't budget for because they weren't known variables at that particular time.
There's also, Marty, there's also some capacity built in there still for additional necessary based on those categorical grants. Yeah.
And that's an important piece, and thank you, David, for bringing that up. We do build in revenue a capacity of $750,000, and in expenditures a capacity of $750,000. That's good business. Why we do that is when we get a grant and we can be awarded that grant, we can receive those funds. And then, if we receive those funds, we can spend those funds. And we do not have to come back to the board for an additional revision to our board budget. So it just makes sense. And we are, right now, looking to obtain pretty significant grants. Nolan is out looking for dollars around facilities. We're looking for an urgent repairs grant, an ADA grant. So there's a good chance that we might be able to be awarded some of those grants. This would give us the capacity to accept them and use them. Yes, Sandy.
So we know that LAP money will come again this year.
It already
Yes.
has.
We know for sure.
It already has.
And we know what it is.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And it's an additional $130,000 because Roosevelt didn't receive it last year. This year they qualified for the Freedom Convention, so it's up there. And some of the expenditures you guys asked about before, Franklin's buying a teacher with theirs. All their money's going into a teacher. So the travel piece that they talked about and worried about, the travel's going to be cut down a bunch because Roosevelt's already getting 2 pair of heads out of their $70,000 going there. So they have much more time to make a better plan than finding out August 15th.
And speaking of the travel, it represents, and Bill, this was another question that both you and I had. So we've gone from the budgeted amount this year of $302,000 to next year projection $182,000, reduction of $119,000. And we feel like, it wasn't Chuck's decision or my decision or David's decision. We sat down, discussed what are known variables around travel, what were the anomalies last year, and how can we make it work. And so we believe that that's a number that we can support.
We did that with the supplies too,
Yeah.
which is what that shows, a reduction there from the last time too.
So we're already in this phase, and you know this, but we're starting to look very closely at all of our known expenses, which I think any good organization does. And so that will be kind of the theme this school year. Okay, next slide. So last month, the board was asking, well, what falls under purchase services on that last slide? Well, these are, some of the big items that exist under purchase services. First, again, that's where our 750 capacity lives. So that's built-in expenses that we know we don't have a plan for just yet, but if we obtain money, we can. There are sped contracts under that, specialists. This year, we're contracting out our Birth to 2 program. You probably are aware of that, yes. And so that money comes to our district, and we contract that out to a local agency to lead that work for our Birth to 2 students. It covers the costs of running start fees, copiers in schools, software license, professional development registrations. Under software license, you're going to get Skyward and other, big systems that support the communications and the student record management system of our district. Next slide. You're going to have a big one under there that falls the food service. Sodexo contract is under purchase services. Other district support, such as utilities for the building, internet, cell phones, business items such as attorneys, elections, audits, memberships, registration, we already mentioned copiers, software systems, and outside services for maintenance. If we have to go beyond our capacity within our maintenance department and contract for an expense, that would fall under purchase services. Okay. Right, now this year, and I think this is great business for the state of Washington, we have been in this cycle of passing levies, used to be called M&O, now called enrichment, and if I slip, please excuse me because it's been so long, right? Yeah. But the new enrichment levy and the new requirements around use of those levy funds require our system to track those funds. And when we track those funds, we have to have a very detailed spending plan to go along with those funds. I think that's great business. I've worked in education now 29 years. This is my 30th year. And levy dollars have always been kind of unaccounted for. It's hard to track where they're really being spent. Not just here, everywhere that I've worked. And so now we have to have, number one, a plan. And number two, we have to be able to code within our financial tracking system what those funds are being utilized for. And we will be audited by the state of Washington on use of those funds. So this year, our recommendation to you for your consideration this evening is to take the $6,446,687 and apply them in these categories. 1, student programs. I'm going to give you more detail on that in just a minute. 2, athletics and extracurricular activities. And I don't need to read the numbers, you see the numbers. 3, transportation costs, and I'm going to give you more detail on that. 4, other enrichment teachers, and I will give you more detail on that. Okay, next slide please. Nope, it's the additional. So here's the details on how we propose those funds to be spent. When we get into the student programs, under the details here, we are proposing that we know that we do not have full-time counselors in all of our buildings with full state funding. We have partial funding of all of our elementary schools. And so we have to invest local dollars if we want to have full-time counselors in all of our schools. So my first recommendation under student programs is we fund that with levy dollars. I think it would be great business. Number 2, we also know that, and I wish I knew the percentage because I would like to make light of it, but we get some really low allocation of nurse time for our school system. I mean, it's really low. It's less than a 1.0 FTE if I remember right, for a school system of 3,600 students. So in order to maintain services that we had last year, my recommendation is for those nursing costs not funded by the state, which is enrichment, of $302,000 and $733, that we add that to our local enrichment costs.
It's 0.6 FTE that they
0.6.
Yeah.
So let's get that. A political statement, 0.6 for 3,700 kids. I'm going to get to the prototypical model. We need to revisit that at the state level. That's really important. Next, music teachers. This district has a second-to-none music program. I mean, as I meet with the community, talk with the community, hear the hundreds of conversations that I'm having, one of the things that rises right to the top of our system being excellent is that music program. So it comes at a cost because music is not at that level in the prototypical model. So my recommendation is the music teachers beyond the prototypical model be placed into our local enrichment levy. at $1.5 million. There's some other music expenses that are equipment and other costs that we put in there of $90,574 for an all-in above the state allocation of $2,505,003. That's recommendation 1. Recommendation 2, big idea number 2, is the athletics and extracurricular fund of $855,554 goes into our enrichment levy as well to support all of our athletic programs and after-school activities. Big idea number 3 is transportation. And this is, I don't know if David agrees with this, I anticipate this to change. We have been told that the new allocation will fully fund transportation, provided that your efficiency rating is high enough. And right now, the OSPI is updating the STAR system, and the STAR system is using the old funding mechanism, and so we don't have the updated version. So the advice or the direction that OSPI has given to David is use the old system and expect an update by January. So if we use the old system, the revenues that we would anticipate is $1.4 million. So my recommendation tonight is, we know that last year our budgeted transportation cost was $1.866 million. My recommendation is we take that $426,000 as a placeholder tonight and place that into our enrichment levy, just so we can make sure we can transport our students to and from school and have a line item to do so. And I will keep you updated. If the board accepts this recommendation, we will keep you updated on the progress of that transportation fund. And finally, as just a placeholder, other enrichment teachers, and this whole concept is new. We haven't had a chance to really get out and work with the schools and the principals around. So what other enrichment teachers should we label to our levy? But, conversations with the high school around, art classes above the funded model. That would be one. Or, class experiences at the middle school beyond the prototypical model that might fall in the area of technology. So we want to engage in those conversations with the staffs of the building to know clearly who we target for those for that $2.659 million. But it would come in the form of teaching and learning. So what I'm bringing to you tonight is, of that $6,446,687, all of it is for teaching and learning, with the exception of the after-school activities and athletics, and that temporary placeholder for the transportation cost. I think that's the way our community wants us to spend those dollars, and I think our conversations in the future around enrichment levies and elections will go very clear when folks know what they're supporting within our programs. Questions? Okay, next slide. So this is, now we're going to drill down a little bit. You've been hearing this presentation for a couple of months, but we need to really know, what are our numbers? Where are our strengths and where are our weaknesses? Where do we fall potentially short? This is an important slide to consider tonight, in my opinion. Now, I've taken 2 pools of money this year, but they used to be very similar. I hope we can come to common agreement that BEA funds and old M&O funds used to be used the same way, right? We used levy dollars to backfill BEA shortfalls. So this kind of uses that premise, although we know we can't do that anymore. But I, as an individual, need to know how much more money we have in those 2 categories. Because we're hearing a lot of stuff out in the community, and we're hearing a lot of reports across the state of all this money coming new to the district, but with the ins and outs, what's the bottom line for Port Angeles? We need to know that, and we need to come to agreement on that so that we can actually make progress in the work that we're doing. And so in the first line item here, I've summarized the budgets, and I'll go down them. I think it's important to go point by point, so please bear with me. I'm not trying to insult your intelligence, but we need to spend some time on this. For the levy, in the 18-19 budgeted, this is not a new number for you, the $6.465 million. That came right out of the presentation I just shared with you. That's what I anticipate, that's what we anticipate. Last year, that number was this, $8,938,432. There's a difference there, okay? But let's go a step further. When we pass our levy, you know we get levy equalization, and so what is the difference there? This year, based on the $6.4 million, and it's a factor of it, they relate to one another, we anticipate $1.2 million in LEA funds. Last year, we received $1,452,836. So there's a little bit of a reduction there as well that we have to know. And we have to recognize that there's a little reduction there. BEA, this is a really important one. The BEA really drives our schools. You know, I call it, it may not be appropriate, but it's called the golden ticket. The BEA funds is what we use to make our schools operate. In our BEA funds, this year we have new revenue in the form of $30,827,424. Last year, you can see we're at $25,632,200. Significant increase, and I think we owe our lawmakers a thank you for that. They did their job. I want to note, I put an asterisk there, please note that that BEA funding does not include the state BEA special ed apportionment. I don't think it's appropriate. BEA funds and levy funds used to be very flexible, and you could be used for a number of expenses. We know that special ed funds are dictated by we are dictated to use those funds for students of special needs. So they're different pools of money. So I removed, out of those two numbers to compare apples to apples, the state apportionment for special education. It just makes sense to me, because again, I have to narrow this down to a very simple form that I can understand. Next, the MSOC money, which Josh, you asked about the MSOC dollars. You can see that this year we anticipate $4.485 million. And last year we had $4.372 million. That number has to be removed from our BEA apportionment because it falls within that number. So I'm trying to narrow it down to what we have here for what we can use for other programs or staffing enhancements or salary enhancements, whatever it might be. So you remove the MSOC dollars from the BEA dollars. You remove the CTE dollars from the BEA dollars. You cannot use the CTE funds for anything less than CTE purposes. So when you do the calculations here, you come right down the list. What new BEA dollars do we have that, and also enrichment levy dollars, that are new to our district, that fall in those two categories, minus all the plus and minuses? Here's the number. This year, $32,044,864. Last year, $29,984,281. A difference of $2,060,583. Now, again, I understand the enrichment dollars have an intent this year, but if we were comparing to last year's expenses, this will be what we would experience in new, flexible dollars that can be used for purposes of your desire. Okay? Now, this is an important point for all of us to hear. This represents a 7% increase in revenue funds in the BEA and levy dollars. 7% increase. from this point to this point. If you take 29 million and divide by the new money of 2 million, it gives you a 7% increase total to the district to cover all of our BEA needs. And remember, our BEA needs are all staffing that is BEA funded. You have teachers, you have principals, you have paraeducators, you have custodians, you have secretaries, they all fall within that BEA funded formula. Can I answer any questions on this? Okay. Next slide. Other considerations where we must be thinking and where we have some challenges. The first is mix factor. The mix factor is gone. And where we have common ground in our community is, that's a concern. I have grave concern for losing the mix factor. And I'm going to show you why. And then I'm going to show you how it really impacts our conversations this year. Let's just say, and I'm using round numbers, we have 250 teachers. That's the premise of the starting point of this conversation. And I picked a district that's not near here. But their mix factor was, last year, 1.38. What that means is 1 full-time plus 38%, basically is what that means. And I picked this year's new base, 40,760. That's the new base that's established by the new funding model. Because I want to compare apples to apples. So if I take 1.38 times $40,760, that brings the compensation level that the state used to, this is all used to, hypothetical to last year, but it's going to come to fruition here in a minute. It used to fund this school district with 1.38 mix factor, $56,249 per full-time teaching certificated employee. If you take that $56,249 and multiply that times 250, that brings you to a cost, again, hypothetical cost, to that district of $14,062,250 bucks. Now I'm going to go through the same for us. Our mix factor last year was 1.58. Multiplied times the base to give us a total of $64,401. Bringing our cost for our staff with 250 teachers at a 1.58 mix factor up to $16,100,250. Okay? So, please note the difference on how the mix factor, because districts, have a new funding mechanism. We have this flat rate. I'm going to get to that in just a minute. But this district was operating on this premise last year. And so one would conclude that their expenses were reflective of that. We were operating on this premise. One can conclude that we were operating on that premise. Look at what happens with the new funding model, and then I'm going to get to the differences. So this year, as you know, we're a temporary regionalization district, and I'm going to use that term. I don't know if it's politically correct or not, but I call it temporary. Okay? And we're going to get to that in just a minute. But we have an allocation dollar per FTE for teachers of $69,129. Every teacher. And so this year, the mix factor's gone. And we just take we take that number times our teachers. Brings the total to $17,282,250. How does that impact our conversations in our district based on our old norms? That's what I'm going with here. So you take that $17 million that's new money for this district on the other side of the mountains of 17.2, you subtract what their old costs used to be, bringing it to $3.2 million in difference. And you're hearing a lot about new money. That's 18% new money to them. based on their existing costs from last year, based on a lot of variables that I'm just trying to compare apples to apples here around what it could have been in the old funding model. Then you go to our consideration here of the $17.2 million minus the $16.1 million that I demonstrated here. The difference is $1,182,000. Okay? And Scott, what percentage was that? Thank you. 8%. So where I'm going with this is every district is different. And every district has their challenges that they're facing based on this old model around mix factor that's no longer recognized by the state of Washington. And it creates huge differences around what districts can and can't do and what they have and what they don't have, based on last year's operating principles, operating norms, let's call it that. And so I'm really concerned about that. It creates challenges for districts that have high mix rates, because now basically with this flat, it's more money, absolutely more money. But the risk of, your experience factor within a district is all on the district now. And when we have a very professional and seasoned staff here that want to be at Port Angeles and want to stay here and made their whole lives and careers here, it's a phenomenal thing to have, but it also creates a challenge based on where do the people fall within the salary schedule, because it's all our risks now. Whereas in the past, there was a built-in mix factor that would help us offset less seasoned staff or more seasoned staff. And so that's a huge change. And I don't think I do not believe that that concept has received enough attention. All of the risk is now on the district. And it's created a huge inequity around what districts do have or don't have to give in year one. Whether that be in program, staffing increases, or salary enhancements. I mean, it's a difference. Very much so. Can I answer a question on, I know that's a lot, but can I answer any questions on that mix factor concern that I have?
Even if we were to use a mix factor in our mind's eye, we do in reality have a high rate of seasoned and experienced teachers.
Yes, we do.
In this school district.
Which is great.
Yeah,
People want to
I'm
be
not
here.
complaining
Absolutely.
about that at all. I'm
Yep.
just saying, I want to be real clear in my
Yep.
mind that even though we don't use that factor of 1.58
Yep.
anymore, we still have to
Yes.
be concerned about paying.
What percentage, Scott, or what number, I hate to put you on the spot, if you're not prepared to answer it, but what percentage do we have at the top end of the council?
It's near 50%, it's about 47%.
So did you hear that? About 47% of our staff fall in the top cell of the salary schedule. And so that's creates some of our challenges.
Of the present
Correct.
salary schedule.
Yep. So that's other consideration number one. That has to weigh on our minds, not only in today's, developing a budget, but also in the future with regards to our population representing that challenge to our lawmakers. I think we are all, very much agreement with regards to the inequities created by this new mechanism for funding schools.
Excuse me, can I ask one more
Yeah.
question? And that's written into McCleary, that's in the new law, where,
The new funding model around just the flat base salary that
Okay.
comes to districts. Yeah.
thank
It's just not in the funding formula anymore. The mix factor is
you.
just
Right,
not
I
there.
understand.
Yep. So, and in the old formula, the only group that had a mix factor was the instructional staff. The next concept is the regionalization. I have great concerns about this as well. And this document here goes into that. There's really two forms of regionalization, and this is important for us to know and understand. The first regionalization is permanent, and I'm going to use my own terminology now. Okay? You can read this and say, what did I just read? It's permanent. There are districts out there that have 18% additional funding, 12% additional funding, 6% additional funding, and 0% additional funding. And that was based on the median home price, or the prices of homes in school districts across the state. So it's not exactly true, but a lot of the schools within King County and Pierce County are your 18s. And that does come across the water to the Kitsap schools. So we do have South Kitsap, Bremerton, North Kitsap, and Central Kitsap are 18% regionalization districts. And so basically, you take that formula, that big beast of a formula, and you enter it in, and there's a multiplier times 18%. And it is times this time, Josh. So, you know, then you have the 12s, and you have the 6s, and you have the 0s. Our district is a 0 regionalization district. If you turn to the back side, you can see that Port Angeles falls about 2, 4, 5, 6 from the bottom. Port Angeles is listed there, and the calculated factor represents 1.0. We're a 0 regionalization district. So permanently, from this standpoint, that's what we've been labeled as, a 0 regionalization district. Temporarily, we do have, and if you keep reading on that same sheet, in 2018-19, in 2019-20 through 2022-23, we have some temporary relief around regionalization. You can see in 18-19 and 19-20 it's 6%. You can see in 2021 and 2021 it's 5%, 2022 it's 4%, and it goes to 2022-23 to 3%. That regionalization was given to our district, you know, by a representation or understanding of our lawmakers that we were considered, for regionalization 0 districts, a high compensation district. Our employees were highly compensated compared to, not the King and Pierce counties of the world, but compared to the other 0s across the state. So our lawmakers recognized that our staff, no one in particular staff, were compensated at a higher level on average than those other 0 regionalization districts. And so we have what I call temporary regionalization. I hope you bear with me on my very layman terms. Now you can see that other districts like Everett, you know, at the top, or Snohomish, they're 18% regionalization districts. They're highly compensated regionalization districts, and they get an additional 6% on top of that. So this year, for the likes of Snohomish and Everett, they get a 24% multiplier on their BEA formula to talk about programs, staffing, and additional enhancements. So this is an important factor for us all in the room to understand, you know, that there are districts very near us that have regionalization permanently and we don't. And so SQUIM is also a permanent regionalization district at 6. And I've been asked the question, well, why SQUIM? I don't know. I'm glad for SQUIM, but I believe it has last year there was some changes made in regionalization around bordering districts. If SQUIM bordered a district that is a regionalization district, then they would get some regionalization. I believe that's the concept that SQUIM was honored, the regionalization assignment. So it's a challenge for us. It's new. I think you know, we have to recognize it, accept it, and make it what it's worth. The challenge is, as you can see, instead of ramping up, it ramps down. So we start at 6, and we transition to 3 over the course of a 5-year period of time. So we have to be really careful about how we budget in year 1, 2, 3, and 4 to represent that potential loss in revenue as it relates to our temporary mix factor. Yes?
Okay, so at the end of 2023 school year,
Yes.
we go back to zero?
That is not certain, David, that is not certain. There will be a recalculation, according to the RCW, there will be a recalculation to address that at a later date. So it is unknown at this point in time. It could go to zero, it could reset, we don't know. I don't know.
Thank you.
So that's another big consideration for our board to look at as it relates to regionalization. I'm running out of time, thanks Josh. The next piece is multi-year revenue comparison. I want to go to the next slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
Another consideration for our board to know, we don't know all the variables. I can't present that to you tonight. I know the variables of this school year, this coming school year, but we don't know the number of variables that will impact us in the next 2 school years. I have taken this right off of the OSPI multi-year budgeting tool, yes. And this represents a forecast based on the variables that OSPI is considering around school funding. The first column here, supplemental 2018-19, you can see the total. Now our numbers don't match up identically, okay? Because this is an estimate that was done starting in January. It's been revisited a number of times, but that's not my purpose of this slide. It doesn't match us exactly, but $48,379,177 in year 1 of the McCleary rollout, okay? The model projects through the transition to year 2 in this model, and I don't think it'll be quite this extreme, but it does represent a $1 million loss in revenue to our district. We have to know that. Not just board, but our community needs to know that could happen, and we have to prepare ourselves for potentially that. My hopes is that this is overestimated, and it may very well be. There are a lot of factors involved in this. Year 3, the same model reflects an approximate loss from year 1, $600,000. So the thing I caution us on as we build budgets this year and in the future, from this document that's produced by OSPI, and I know there's others that feel there's other pieces to this, but this could be, not certain, but it could be our highest revenue year over the next 3 years. We could receive more revenue this year than the next 2 years, which creates a consideration for us as we talk through budget development now and in the future. We have to know that so that we can prepare for, potentially some shortfalls in the coming years. Questions on this? Next slide, please. So now we're to the easy stuff again. So back to, there's been no changes on the student body ASB funds. So you saw that last month. If there's no questions, I'll move forward. Debt service funds, there's been no change to that proposal for budget. Next slide. Capital, I know there's a big one for folks on our board. I am recommending this year that we do not do any kind of transfer to capital funds. What you see there in the form of a proposed budget of $525,000 is existing from a transfer that was made several years ago. And Nolan's been very fiscally sound with those dollars, holding on to those in case we had a need that was urgent in the schools. And so my recommendation to the board through this budget planning process is no transfer at this time. Next slide. Transportation vehicle, no change. And then the normal. So now I will open it up to questions from the board around anything that I can try to make a little more clear for you.
I have a question about when they said the regionalization.
Yeah.
And they compared our district to other districts with zero regionalization. Did you just say that our staff, we're just talking about certified staff now?
I'm talking compensation,
Right, but
which would be
all staff?
all of the above.
Okay. Was considerably, we compensated them higher than the other districts that fell in this zero?
From the assessment of the temporary regionalization assignment, based on 0 regionalization districts, our
Right.
district was given temporary regionalization because of a higher than the average compensation level of other regionalization districts.
Okay.
That is the answer.
I think that's a really important thing that we have, I don't know what my colleagues, but I did not realize that that's how they assigned the regionalization percentages.
Remember, there's 2 forms of regionalization. But yes, the first is based on home prices and home values.
Right.
The second is based on, you know, the concept kind of do no harm, and we need more money to get through the initial steps of the McCleary funding position. So, but yes. Other questions?
Do our legislators understand this?
I'm sure they do. Yeah.
I haven't, I mean, we've talked to them and been in meetings with all 3 of them and so forth, and no one has ever mentioned this.
Yeah.
They've never mentioned, have they mentioned it? Do you remember them? Does anybody remember them mentioning that our compensation was higher? I think I would have caught that.
Well, I'm bringing it to you tonight.
I know. But we've been talking about this for a very long time. This is not...
And it's a good thing that we have that temporary regionalization. It helps us.
If we get to...
It helps us. So,
Okay, thank you.
other questions I can answer?
So that compensation piece though, that, yes, we're higher, but does that also reflect our mix factor, right? I mean, we compensate, or is that?
Well, compensation and mix factor would go hand in hand.
Right, so when they're looking at us compared to, say, Crescent, for
So
example.
I'm gonna say my assumption is yes, but I can't give you a definite. But it seems that though it would, because mix, experience of staff, and compensation go hand in hand. But I'm giving you an assumed yes.
So we've done that media, that means...
Anyone else have any?
That's very clear. That's very clear.
Okay, can we have any additional feedback on the levy? Is there anything that you would like us to address based on our initial presentation this evening?
Well, when I entered the board right after Josh and our other board member, it was my understanding that even though the law did not require us to say how we were going to spend the levy money, we did that. This board did that, and we have stuck to that until now. When they came in and cut the levy, now we can't stick to that plan anymore. And I want the public to know that also, that we did have a very specific plan, and we advertised it, and they voted on it, and there you go.
And I think
now we can't play with, we can't do it anymore.
And I think we need to do a really good job of communicating that message to our community.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, in great detail to a lot of groups of people. They need to understand that we can no longer go by that plan, even though they voted on that plan.
Yes.
And I think they can talk to their legislators about that.
I will work on that.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.